most licentious of human institutions.
What?
I say the most licentious of human institutions. That is the secret of its popularity. And a woman seeking a husband is the most unscrupulous of all the beasts of prey. The confusion of marriage with morality has done more to destroy the conscience of the human race than any other single error.
That was Don Juan, sounding off in Bernard Shaw's great play, Man and Superman, written nearly 80 years ago, just after Shaw himself got married. The whole Don Juan in Hell scene is an extraordinary dream sequence, in most of which the devil and Don Juan argue passionately about good and evil, man's nature, and his ultimate destiny. Shaw called his play a comedy and a philosophy. Most of the philosophy is in this scene, in the third act, but because of its length, most productions omit the scene. In fact, there hasn't been a complete production of Man and Superman in a British theatre since 1951, until a couple of weeks ago, that is, when Christopher Morahan's production opened at the National Theatre. We thought it would be interesting to examine the play to see how it relates to Shaw's own life and marriage, and to see how relevant the arguments are today, 31 years after Shaw's death. We don't think that using a play in this way, testing it against its own predictions of the future with real documentary footage, has ever been done before. In his programme, Tony Cash has looted liberally from the film archives to prove that the arguments of the devil and Don Juan still describe man's fundamental predicaments some 80 years after they were written. We have a number of extracts from the Don Juan in Hell scene and 3 Shaw experts to comment on them from different points of view. The plot of the play is this. A rich young English gentleman with socialist inclinations, Jack Tanner, is fleeing from Anne Whitfield, who wants to trap him in marriage. In a dream, he sees himself as Don Juan, the hero of legend and opera, who was carried off to hell by a statue originally erected to honour the commander whom Don Juan had slain while pursuing the old man's daughter, Doña Ana. In his dream, Don Juan meets up with Doña Ana, her father the commander, on a visit to hell because he finds heaven too dull, and the devil himself. We join them again as Don Juan expounds his views on marriage.
The confusion of marriage with morality has done more to destroy the conscience of the human race than any other single error. Oh, come, Anna, don't look shocked. When your sainted mother forced you to learn to play half a dozen pieces on the spinet, which she hated as much as you did, had she any other purpose than to delude your suitor into believing that your husband would have in his home an angel who would fill it with melody, or at least play him to sleep after dinner? You married my friend Ottavio. Well, did you ever open the spinet from the hour when the church united him to?
A young married woman has something else to do than sit at a spinet with no support to her back, so she gets out of the way of playing.
Not if she loves music. No, she only throws away the bait when the bird is in the net.
And man, I suppose, never throws off the mask when their bird is in the net. The husband never becomes negligent, selfish, brutal. Oh, never.
What do these recriminations prove, Anna? Only that the hero is as gross an imposture as the heroine.
It is all nonsense. Most marriages are perfectly comfortable.
Oh, perfectly is a strong expression, Anna. What you mean is that sensible people must make the best of one another. Send me to the galleys and chain me to the felon whose number happens to be next before mine, and I must accept the inevitable and make the best of the companionship. Many such companionships, so they tell me, are touchingly affectionate, and most are at least tolerably friendly. But that does not make a chain a desirable ornament or the galleys an abode of bliss. Those who talk most about the blessings of marriage and the constancy of its vows are the very people who declare that if the chains were broken and the prisoner left free to choose, the whole social fabric would fly asunder. You cannot have the argument both ways. If the prisoner is happy, why lock him in? If he's not, why pretend that he is?
At all events, let me take an old woman's privilege again and tell you flatly, marriage peoples the world and debauchery does not.
However time come when this shall cease to be true. Do you not know that where there is a will, there is a way? That what man really wishes to do, he will finally discover a means of doing? Well, you have done your best, you virtuous ladies and those of your way of thinking, to bend man's mind wholly towards honorable love as the highest good. You have taught women to value their youth, shapeliness, and refinement above all things. Well, what place have squalling babies in this exquisite paradise of the senses? Is it not the inevitable end of it all that the human will shall say to the human brain, invent me a means whereby I can have love, beauty, passion without their wretched penalties, their illnesses, their expenses, their risks of death, their retinue of nurses and doctors and schoolmasters.
All this, Senor Don Juan, is realized here in my realm.
Yes, at the cost of death. Man will not take it at that price. He demands the romantic delights of your hell whilst he is still on earth. Well, the means will be found. The brain will not fail when the will is in earnest. The day is coming when great nations will find their numbers dwindling from census to census, when the six-roomed villa will rise in price above the family mansion, whilst the boldly prudent, the thriftily selfish, the imaginative and poetic, the worshipper of success, of love, of art, will all oppose to the force of life the device of sterility.
The whole thing is, of course, an outrageous irony on Shaw's part. Here he is writing a play in which he suggests that the only hope for humanity is the kind of marriage which will produce desirable children. It's a kind of eugenic platform, really. And it's written by a man who resolutely refused, or was incapable, or didn't fancy, we don't know which, to consummate his own marriage. So here is a man writing a most eloquent plea for the desirability of a eugenically arranged marriage, who is himself totally incapable or undesirous of doing anything towards the production of the Superman himself.
Shaw was a writer and a workaholic, and like many creative people, he believed that marriage was a trap set by woman, especially if it involved having a lot of children. But on the other hand, he also recognized that in order for the human race to survive, one needed to have children, and he believed better children, better breed of children. And so you get the sex war in Shaw between the artist man who wants to show people what Superman is like, and the mother woman who wants to breed Superman. And there's that inevitable tension. And Shaw recognizes as a writer, of course, that each needs the other. But as a man, he can't live up to that exalted ideal, and so his is a childless marriage.
There are a number of themes within the play itself which are repeated. There's the notion of the life force, which you could say is like a motif, a musical motif, which is repeated as well within the form of the play. And in this, I think that Shaw and his concern for actually forging new paths in drama and in the plays of his time, or against the plays of his time, an awful lot of them which he found rather dusty and dry and rather empty, he wanted to re-establish a value of his work, not only in terms of ideas, but also in terms very similar to music, having the kind of emotional drive and the quality of expression which made it as close to music as anything has been in English drama up to that time.
The Man and Superman was Shaw's first major statement about marriage, which is not surprising because it was a new subject to him. It was a fresh experience. It was his first major work after he'd first tasted, if you like, the joys of marriage. And I think that what's typical about Shaw is the way he saw marriage, or affected to see it. Now, in the Star, June the 2nd, 1898, there's a curious report going as follows. As a lady and gentleman were out driving in Henrietta Street, Covent Garden, yesterday, a heavy shower drove them to take shelter in the office of the Superintendent Registrar there. And in the confusion of the moment, he married them. The lady was an Irish lady named Miss Payne Townsend, and the gentleman was George Bernard Shaw. Now, that's not only comical, but it's very germane to Shaw's whole approach, not only to marriage, but to everything. The calculated levity, to half deny that he ever meant to get married at all, that it's a trap into which a sensible man like him would never fall, but circumstances became a farce, and therefore, etc., etc. That's not only typical of Shaw as a bridegroom, but it's typical of Shaw as a literary operator. What Shaw was looking for in a wife was really a domestic manager, a troubleshooter, kind of intellectual chatelaine, somebody that would do all the dirty work of an ordinary everyday life that he was too lazy to do or didn't want to do. Charlotte was looking for, I think, a pleasant gentleman, as the musical will say, to do for. Somebody to look after, something for her to occupy her time, something she thought was worthwhile because he was an important man. The one thing that neither of them was looking for was a sexual partner. So it was, in a sense, a sexless, but I wouldn't say a passionless marriage.
A great deal of the argument in the Parliament in Hell scene is about marriage and the place of marriage in the scheme of things. And this reminds us of one thing, that this isn't an old-fashioned theological debate about heaven and hell, but it's about how life should be lived in this world. That's what makes it modern. Basically, Don Juan says, what life's about is striving for higher things. The devil says, no, it's not. It's about trying to enjoy ourselves. And that's the argument.
Can anybody go to heaven if they want to?
Certainly, if your taste lies that way.
But why doesn't everybody go to heaven then?
I can tell you that, my dear. It's because heaven is the most angelically dull place in all creation, that's why.
His Excellency the Commander puts it with military bluntness, but the strain of living in heaven is intolerable. There's a notion that I was turned out of it, but as a matter of fact, nothing could have induced me to stay there. I simply left it and organized this place.
I don't wonder at it. Nobody could stand an eternity of heaven.
Oh, no, it suits some people. Let us be just, Commander. It takes all sorts to make a universe. There's no accounting for taste. I think Don Juan would like it.
But could you really go back there if you desired to? Or are the grapes sour?
I often go back there. Have you never read the book of Job? Have you any canonical authority for assuming there's any barrier between our circle and the other one?
Oh, but surely there is a great gulf, fixed.
But, dear lady, a parable must not be taken literally. The gulf is the difference between the angelic and the diabolic temperament. What more impassable gulf could you have? Think of what you've seen on earth. Have you ever been in the country where I have the largest following? England. There they have great race courses, and also concert rooms where they play the classical compositions of His Excellency's friend, Mozart. Those who go to the race courses can stay away from them and go to the classical concerts instead if they like. There's no law against it. For Englishmen never will be slaves. They are free to do whatever the government and public opinion allow them to do. And the classical concert is admitted to be a higher, more cultivated, poetic, intellectual, ennobling place than the race course. But do the lovers of racing desert their sport and flock to the concert room? Not they. They would suffer there all the weariness the Commander has suffered in heaven. There is the great gulf of the parable between the two places. A mere physical gulf they could bridge, or I could bridge it for them. The earth is full of devil's bridges. But the gulf of dislike is impassable and eternal. And that is the only gulf that separates my friends here from those that are invidiously called the blessed.
I shall go to heaven at once.
My child, one word of warning first. At every one of these concerts in England, you'll find rows of weary people who are there not because they really like classical music, but because they think they ought to like it. Well, there's the same thing in heaven. A number of people sit there in glory, not because they're happy, but because they think they owe it to their position to be in heaven. They are almost all English.
The English really do not seem to know when they are thoroughly miserable. An Englishman thinks he is moral when he is only uncomfortable.
In short, my daughter, if you go to heaven without being naturally qualified for it, you will not enjoy yourself there.
Shaw was, in antecedents, an English Protestant Irishman. Well, Shaw's attitude to the English, I think, is of a man who loves them enough to castigate them and try and train them to be civilised. I don't think he thought they were really civilised. So he became a kind of alien conscience that the English were very uncomfortable about. Shaw didn't make it easy for them. For instance, he wrote this in 1904, significantly not to an Englishman, to an American. I, who have been struggling for more than a quarter of a century with the knavish brainlessness of the English, lose patience often enough. But I get on very well with them personally. I find them enormously interesting. I've got a good deal of training from them, and in short, intend to stay here and be one of the glories of their literature. And the fact that Shaw wasn't an Englishman enabled him to see English society, English behaviour, English mores, English beliefs, English attitudes from a very strangely oblique angle. And if you see something from an oblique angle, different lights reflect on it. And so Shaw saw a different picture of the British Empire, the English upper classes, English justice, etc., etc.
Shaw was a music critic for a number of years, a very distinguished one, and he did a very great deal, interestingly enough, in making the English public more aware than they should have been of Mozart's qualities as a composer. And it's interesting that in his stage directions and the way that he actually wrote about how the play should be performed, that he was as meticulous as one would expect a composer to be, actually, as he notated the music. He was meticulous in two ways. He had stage directions, which were very long and delightful to read, and one has to be quite careful about them because I suspect as much as anything they were there to be designed to be read as one read the play. They are part of the entertainment as you read a book. And I suspect, too, when he actually sat and read the plays to his companies, which is what he did, he would often read the stage directions as well, which is the kind of performance that he actually put on himself. There was a kind of secret notation in his writing, which is very interesting, which a director avoids at great danger. It's the secret notation of punctuation. His full stops, his commas, his semicolons, and his colons. And if the actor follows that, and with, I don't say rigidity, but if he uses that as a guide, he will find himself led towards a way of performing it which has great elegance, drives the philosophic points home, and allows the actor also to get the laughs that he should get, because they're beautifully constructed.
Shaw, the Irishman, has been poking fun at what he sees as a peculiarly English idea of goodness. That is, that one isn't really being good unless one's completely miserable. And so heaven is full of English people going to classical concerts and listening to classical music because they think that's the done thing. Now, Shaw's trying to develop a different idea of goodness, maybe an Irish idea of goodness. He says goodness isn't denying oneself pleasure, it's indulging virtue. And he once called himself a voluptuary, and he added, "I never deny myself a Beethoven symphony." Anyway, I think the serious point underneath all this joking is simply this, that if people think that goodness is simply doing the done thing, then the devil will always win. And what Don Juan's really saying is we need a more robust ideal of goodness. Goodness as working for a better world, goodness as losing oneself in some great enterprise or something of that kind. And that's the point at which the serious argument starts.
Heaven is the home of the masters of reality. That is why I am going thither.
Thank you. Well, I am going to heaven for happiness. I've had quite enough reality on earth.
Then you must stay here, for hell is the home of the unreal and the seekers for happiness. The earth is a nursery in which men and women play at being heroes and heroines, saints and sinners, but they are dragged down by their bodies. Hunger and cold and thirst, age and decay and disease, death, above all, make them slaves of reality. Thrice a day meals must be eaten and digested. Thrice a century a new generation must be engendered. But here, you escape this tyranny of the flesh. Here you are a ghost, an illusion, deathless, ageless, in a word, bodiless. There are no social questions here, no political questions, no religious questions. Best of all, perhaps, no sanitary questions. Here you call your appearance beauty, your emotions love, your sentiments heroism, just as you did on earth. But here, there are no hard facts to contradict you, no ironic contrast of your needs with your pretensions, no human comedy, nothing but a perpetual romance, a universal melodrama, and yet you want to leave this paradise?
But if hell be so beautiful as this, how glorious must heaven be?
Oh, my dear lady, that is the profound... I beg your pardon.
Not at all. I interrupted you.
You were going to say something. After you, gentlemen.
You've been so eloquent on the advantages of my dominions, I leave it to you to do equal justice to the drawbacks of the alternative establishment.
In heaven, as I picture it, dear lady, you live and work instead of playing and pretending. You face things as they are. If the play still goes on here and on earth and all the world's a stage, heaven is at least behind the scenes, and thither I shall go presently. For there I hope to escape at last from lies and the tedious vulgar pursuit of happiness, to spend my eons in contemplation. Senor Commander, I do not blame your disgust. A picture gallery is a dull place for a blind man. But even as you enjoy the contemplation of such romantic mirages as beauty and pleasure, so would I enjoy the contemplation of that which interests me above all things, namely, life, the force which ever strives to attain greater power of contemplating itself. What made this brain of mine, do you think? Not the need to move my limbs. A rat with half my brains moves as well as I. No. Not merely the need to do, but the need to know what I do.
But is there nothing in heaven but contemplation, Juan?
In the heaven I seek, no other joy. But there is the work of helping life in its struggle upwards. Think of how it wastes and scatters itself. How it raises up obstacles to itself and destroys itself in its ignorance and blindness. It needs a brain, this irresistible force, lest in its ignorance it should resist itself. What a piece of work is man, says the poet. Yes, but what a blunderer. Here is the highest miracle of organization yet attained by life, the most intensely alive thing that exists. And yet how wretched are his brains. Stupidity, made sordid and cruel by the realities learnt from toil and poverty. Imagination resolved to starve sooner than face those realities, piling up illusions to hide them and calling itself cleverness, genius.
The first thing I could think of in connection with the tyranny of the flesh is his amazing, extraordinary reaction to his first encounter with sexual experience. I mean, there's a man in his late 20s who is, according to his own description, seduced by an older and more experienced woman. And he describes the orgasm as something so wonderful that he hopes and expects that one day human beings will experience this moment of divine pleasure continuously when they think. When I first read this as a young man, it seemed to be not only appalling, but astonishing that any mind could jump from one thing to the other, that eventually thought would become an ecstasy producing an orgasm. But I think it's very indicative of the extent to which Shaw would like to have had the enjoyment without the bodily contact. He talks about being provided with 3 meals a day. Well, he didn't need 3 meals a day. He overcame that. He talks about the need to supply new generations 3 times a century. Well, he overcame that. He lived an ordinary long old age. So Shaw's life really is a defiant gesture against the devil or against God, I don't know who. But what he's trying to do is to eliminate as many of the bodily functions as possible. Certainly he was a man who believed in the philosophic sense that to conquer the body, to subjugate its passions, its appetites, its desires, even its necessities, was absolutely essential if man was to develop into something capable of administering his own affairs. In other words, if the Superman was to come, the Superman would not be interested in steak and kidney pies or naked ladies. You had to evolve onwards and upwards from that.
The debate between Don Juan and the devil is usually left out when in productions of this play, but to me it's incredibly prophetic. Lots of people say about Shaw's plays that they're very witty, but they're hopelessly out of date. They have nothing to tell us today. But I don't think that's right. Here we have a play written in 1903, which is about, it's about how life should be lived in our century. And to me, it's extremely relevant. There are 2 things, really, which strike me as important. The first is, what is it that makes people happy? And the second is, how should we organize life to prevent ourselves destroying the world? And I don't think you can find 2 more relevant themes than that. And I'd just like to explain what I mean by that. For many people, especially in Western affluent societies, it seemed, or seemed till recently, that the major economic problems had been solved. Work would form an ever-diminishing part of people's lives. In fact, for the idle rich of Shaw's day, which included everyone living on quite modest unearned incomes, the economic problem already seemed to have been solved. And it was to them that the devil spoke so seductively. As prosperity has become more general, more and more people have been taking the devil's advice. You can see it in the cult of youth, in the cult of the beautiful people, which sprang up in the late 1960s and which continues to our own day. You can see it in the enormous spread of the entertainment industry. You can see it in the sexual revolution. You can see it in the drug culture. You can see it in abstract forms of art. An endless escape from age, from ugliness, from work, from having babies, from care, and from worry. In short, from reality. And why not, says the devil? Essentially, for two reasons, Don Juan says. Man has to know and understand what he's doing. The best he can hope for, Don Juan seems to say, is that happiness will come about as a byproduct of doing something else, whether it's thinking, building, creating. The direct pursuit of happiness will lead only to misery. And were Shaw alive today, were he to come back and witness our own age's intense concentration on the direct pursuit of happiness, what would he say? Would he say that we had really found happiness, or would he only notice greater misery and discontent all round? The second reason why the devil's got it all wrong, Don Juan seems to argue, is because we can't afford escapism. It's an illusion to think that we'll ever get to the point where we can say, look, we've solved all our problems, we can afford to relax. Every problem solved creates a fresh challenge. And that's why, Don Juan says, we have to go on striving upwards or we'll die. Man's quest for knowledge and understanding has set him off on a great adventure, that of transforming his environment, conquering the universe. He can't now say, stop the world, I want to get off. Science has opened up a vista of play and plenty, but every time we grasp for it, it's somehow snatched away as some new disaster strikes. Today, as the economy spirals downwards and nuclear weapons pile up ever more threateningly, it's the Peter Pan world that seems hopelessly out of date, not George Bernard Shaw. If he were alive today, I'm certain he'd be telling us all to cut it out and buckle down to it. Don Juan's insistence that we're stuck with brains provokes the devil into his first big counterattack. What have brains ever done, he says, except to devise more and more perfect weapons of destruction? If we listen to the devil's speech and recall the awful things that have happened this century, all the wars and now the nuclear weapons and everything, we can see how relevant his remarks are.
In the arts of life, man invents nothing. But in the arts of death, he outdoes nature herself and produces by chemistry and machinery all the slaughter of plague, pestilence, and famine. The peasant I tempt today eats and drinks what was eaten and drunk by the peasant of 10,000 years ago. And the house he lives in has not altered as much in 1,000 centuries as the fashion of a lady's bonnet in a score of weeks. But when he goes out to slay, he carries a marvel of mechanism that lets loose at the touch of his finger all the hidden molecular energies and leaves the arrow of his fathers far behind. In the arts of peace, man is a bungler. I've seen his cotton factories and the like, with machinery that a greedy dog could have invented if it had wanted money instead of food. There's nothing in man's industrial machinery but his greed and sloth. His heart is in his weapons. This marvelous force of life of which you boast is a force of death. Man measures his strength by his destructiveness. What is his religion? An excuse for hating me. What is his law? An excuse for hanging you. What is his morality? Gentility. An excuse for consuming without producing. What is his art? An excuse for gloating over pictures of slaughter. What are his politics? Either the worship of a despot because a despot can kill, or parliamentary cockfighting. It is the same in everything. The highest form of literature is the tragedy, a play in which everybody is murdered at the end. In the old chronicles, you read of earthquakes and pestilences, and are told these showed the majesty and power of God and the littleness of man. Nowadays, the chronicles describe battles. In a battle, two bodies of men shoot at one another with bullets and explosive shells until one body runs away. And this, the chronicle concludes, shows the power and majesty of empires and the littleness of the vanquished. Over such battles, the people run about the streets yelling with delight and egg their governments on to spend hundreds of millions of money in the slaughter, whilst the strongest ministers dare not spend an extra penny in the pound against poverty and pestilence. The power that governs the earth is not the power of life, but of death. And the inner need that has nerved life to the effort of organizing itself into the human being is not the need for higher life, but for a more efficient engine of destruction. The plague, the famine, the earthquake, the tempest were too spasmodic in their action. Something more constantly, more ruthlessly, more ingeniously destructive was needed. And that something was man.
The Devils is a depressing and perceptive comment, coming as it does at the dawn of our age of war and nuclear weapons. What he seems to be saying is, when we try to be serious, we end up destroying ourselves. So why not try being frivolous for a change? But the argument isn't conclusive, it seems to me, because if we look back on the 20th century, we may discover that the only reason we've been destroying ourselves is that we've spent so much time playing. In other words, we haven't been taking our evolutionary challenges seriously enough. When Shaw talks about evolutionary urge, he means one thing: the urge which men have to transcend their past achievements, both their own and those of the whole human race. People who consciously try to strive upwards. Don Juan gave pride of place himself to the philosopher's attempt to understand the universe. But the scientists, the artists, the builders are also examples of Shavian's Superman. And so are people like Roger Bannister trying to break the 4-minute mile and other sportsmen. The Superman is any person, man or woman, who consciously tries to set new standards and succeeds in doing so. It's in such people that the life force flows most strongly.
One of the most striking things to me about the whole Don Juan in Hell scene is that whatever you may find in the statements of the Devil and Don Juan, what you won't find is any encouragement for the conventional Christian. Because although the counters in the game, the devil, heaven, hell, they're all part of the Christian structure, in actual fact, the devil doesn't believe in Christianity any more than Don Juan does. Each of them have their alternatives, and I think that that aspect of it Shaw's attack on Christianity, and it needs to be elucidated, because people have often made the crude mistake of thinking that Shaw didn't believe in Christianity, therefore he was an atheist. Shaw said many times that he wasn't, and he did what he could to explain the difference. He wrote this, for instance, to a young person. This is in 1906. The most earnestly religious people, when they speak of God, do not mean Jehovah or anything like Jehovah. They really mean the purpose behind evolution. And then again, he says, the third act of Man and Superman will remain on record as a statement of my creed. If you care to read it, you will see that it belongs to a stage of thought at which the term atheist is as useless and as obsolete as any of the sectarian terms to which it's usually opposed. What he's saying is that the term atheism only has an application when you are jousting against Christianity. Once the beast is slain, it's pointless to talk of atheism. What you must do when you say, I don't believe in that, is not the platform of the atheist, I believe in nothing. I believe in something else. In other words, you only have the privilege to destroy religion if you have an alternative. And the great intellectual gallantry of Shaw's whole life is his optimistic determination to offer an alternative.
As long as I can conceive something better than myself, I cannot be easy unless I'm striving to bring it into existence. That is the working within me of life's incessant aspiration towards higher and higher organization and clearer self-understanding. It was the supremacy of this purpose that reduced love for me to the mere pleasure of the moment. Art, for me, to the mere schooling of my faculties. Religion, for me, to a mere excuse for laziness, since it set up a God who looked at the world and saw that it was good, against the instinct in me that it could be improved. I tell you that in the pursuit of my own pleasures, I have never known happiness. That is what has made this place of eternal pleasures so deadly to me. It is the absence of this instinct in you that makes you that strange monster called a devil. It is a success with which you have diverted the attention of men from their real purpose, which in one degree or another is the same as mine to yours, that has earned you the name of the tempter. It is the fact that they are doing your will, or rather drifting with your want of will, instead of doing their own, that makes them the false, restless, petulant, wretched creatures they are.
Don Juan, you are uncivil to my friends.
Oh, pooh. In this palace of lies, a truth or two will not hurt you.
When Darwin destroyed the Bible, inadvertently perhaps, but destroyed the Bible, it swept away any code of conduct for an intelligent person, because up to then people would do what they thought was the right thing, either because they wanted to get to heaven or because they were frightened that God would blow them to pieces. After Darwin, this, I suppose rule by fear in a sense, disappeared. That meant that there was no moral code by which people could conveniently measure their own behaviour. Shaw did not approve of Darwin's evolutionary theories as an ethical code. As a scientific theory, fine. What horrified Shaw was that the accidental nature by which Darwin suggested species evolved or died out. Shaw's friend Samuel Butler said that what Darwin had done was to banish mind from the universe. In other words, the best, most fitted animals didn't survive, just the strongest, luckiest ones. To somebody like Shaw, or indeed Samuel Butler, the idea of mind and intellect playing no part was horrific. And Butler, when he said Darwin banished mind from the universe, stated the case for Shaw's distaste for crude, old-fashioned survival of the fittest Darwinism. What Shaw said was that the animal with the strongest mind, the one that wills itself to adapt to conditions, is the one that will survive. In other words, intellectual virtue guarantees survival. This is a wonderful basis for a code of ethical conduct, because you should always do, when you have a choice, when you're in a dilemma, always choose the course of action which, in your opinion, will push the evolutionary process further forward, onward and upward. So that if you have a choice between what the Christian would call good and evil, in your case it's a choice between extinction and evolving.
The trouble with trying to develop an evolutionary code of morals is quite simple. People don't agree on what evolution is. Now, Shaw had his private vision of what evolution was, and we all have our private visions. And as long as the whole thing's kept on a private enterprise basis, there's no harm in it. In fact, it's rather good rule that people should live their lives according to their vision of what a good life is, and be an example and an inspiration to others. But the trouble is, as the devil quite rightly says, when you try and translate the vision into politics, it's then that things start going wrong. Because then you get a leader who comes along and says, I have a vision of what the future should be, and I'm going to come into power, and I'm going to put my vision into effect. History tells me what it is, my intuition tells me what it is, whatever it may be, and anyone who's opposed to it, I'm going to destroy, because they're enemies of progress, they're enemies of the human race, and they are reactionaries. And many people have come along and done that this century. Hitler did it, Stalin did it, Chairman Mao did it. And they killed millions of people in the process of doing it. And of course, no one has the right to do that, because no one is God, and no one knows for certain what the way forward is. Now, part of Shaw, I'm sure, wanted to play God, had those godlike intentions, but another part of him saw the dangers, and so he was constantly undermining himself, actually, by giving the devil many of the best lines.
I prefer to be my own master, and not the tool of any blundering universal force. I know that beauty is good to look at, that music is good to hear, that love is good to feel, and that they are all good to talk about and to think about. Whatever they say of me in churches on earth, I know that it is universally admitted in good society that the Prince of Darkness is a gentleman, and that is enough for me. As to your life force, which you think irresistible, it is the most resistible thing in the world for a person of any character. But if you are naturally vulgar and credulous, as all reformers are, it will thrust you first into religion, where you'll sprinkle water on babies to save their souls from me. It will then drive you from religion into science, where you'll snatch the babies from the water sprinkling and inoculate them with disease to save them from catching it accidentally. Then you'll take to politics, where you'll become the cat's paw of corrupt functionaries and the henchman of ambitious humbugs. The end will be despair and decrepitude, broken nerves and shattered hopes, vain regrets for the waste and sacrifice of the power of enjoyment. In a word, the punishment of the fool who pursues the better before he has secured the good.
Well, at least I shall not be bored. The service of the life force has that advantage at all events. So fare you well, Senor Satan.
In this extract, the devil is reiterating his vision of hell, and it's noticeable how subtle a vision it is. He's not a vulgar hedonist at all. As he himself says, I am also on the intellectual plane, and the Prince of Darkness is a gentleman. Hell, in other words, is both bingo and good conversation. And it's noticeable that the argument takes place in hell, not heaven. An argument of very high quality as well. Also significant is the fact that the devil is much the wittier of the two.
It's been questioned whether Shaw ever expected his plays to be done. I mean, he wrote at one point, "Where will you find a Don Juan willing to learn that prodigious part and intelligent enough to make it interesting?" And later on another occasion, he said to a French translator that the play was useless as an acting play. It is as long as 3 Meyerbeer operas, and no audience that had not already had a Shaw education could stand it. I suspect that he issued these edicts as challenges, really. I can't believe that a man of that conceit, because he was a conceited man, would expect his plays, in fact, not to be done. Yet at the same time, his conceit, in fact, led him to put forward the proposition that his plays were extremely difficult, because they were extremely demanding. Now, I believe that is an exaggeration. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing the play, because I think the play is extremely entertaining. And though difficult in its length, we think that the whole play does make a whole which is not actually fully realized in the shortened version. He was a joker as a playwright. He was also a joker in life. I think that he found himself on occasions absurd. And it's this mixture of the seriousness of what is said and the humor with which he actually observes himself saying it, which makes the particular signature, I think, on a great deal of Shaw's plays. I don't think we want to underestimate his power as a pamphleteer and as a socialist. My father, for instance, was a socialist, as much because of the writings of Shaw and the ragged trouser philanthropist. For a whole generation, he was a spokesman for a new world. Yet at the same time, he frequently found himself cutting a rather ridiculous figure and rather enjoyed it. Jack Tanner, in the play, who is a profound thinker, a socialist, with a very splendid concern for the mind and for man's ability to be able to create a new world or a better world, at the same time is frequently caught during the play in positions of absolute lunacy. He, on a couple of occasions, Anne Whitfield catches him in the act of making political speeches and deflates him. And it's this balance of the seriousness and deflation which I think is the particular signature of Shaw.
People are very funny about the question of genius and greatness. They expect their great men to be solemn. They sometimes even expect them to be solemn boobies. And when a great man starts standing on his head and doing a tap dance, they suspect the seriousness of his message. What in fact they're doing is to confuse seriousness with solemnity. And Shaw had a lot of trouble in this way. People thought he was a joker. So he was, but what they didn't understand was that the Joker is sometimes the most serious man on the premises. Shaw was the most serious comedian in the history of literature. And he said every joke is an earnest in the womb of time. That was, I think, because some of his best and most profound ideas came to him in the form of a joke. I think the greatest mistake anybody could make would be to follow this false syllogism. The fate of the world is a very serious business. People who make us laugh are not serious, therefore Shaw is a joker. Disastrous. We mustn't be frightened to laugh in our most serious moments. And if there is a great message that we can find in this immense body of work, it's that laughter doesn't cancel out seriousness.
The argument sways backwards and forwards between the protagonists, and as the scene draws to its close, the devil seems to be getting the upper hand. It's the idealists, he says, who kill millions, not the pleasure seekers, and that's a very powerful argument. And it's a paradox, that, because it's the devil who seems to be standing for moral principles.
Beware of the pursuit of the superhuman. It leads to an indiscriminate contempt for the human. To a man, horses and dogs and cats are mere species outside the moral world. Well, to the Superman, men and women are mere species too, also outside the moral world. This Don Juan was kind to women and courteous to men, as your daughter here was kind to her pet cats and dogs. But such kindness is a denial of the exclusively human character of the soul.
And who the deuce is the Superman?
Oh, the latest fashion among the life force fanatics. The 20th century will run after this newest of the old crazes when it grows tired of the world, the flesh, and your humble servant. Now, my friend, let us hasten to my palace and celebrate your arrival with a grand musical service.
With pleasure, you're most kind.
This way, Commander. We go down the old trapper.
Good. All the same, the Superman is a fine conception. Something statuesque about him. Ah, this reminds me of old times.
Me also.
Stop! Tell me, where can I find the Superman?
He is not yet created, Senora.
And never will be, probably. Let us proceed. The red fires will make me sneeze.
Not yet created? And my work is not yet done.
I find it a marvelous love story. And in the end, the play is a celebration of life. There are moments of great joy, of great true sentiment, of splendid observation, of frailty, the comedy of the person who believes he is more important than he is, the person who believes that his philosophy is grander than anybody else's, the intricate comedy of human relationships, I think, are realized with great delight in Shaw's work.
It's not clear who does win the argument, whether it's Don Juan or the devil in the play. Of course, as a man and as a politician, Shaw was very much on Don Juan's side, because Shaw was a socialist, and while he was writing Man and Superman, he was also an active Fabian and preaching socialism on the street corners. But it's a sign of his greatness as a dramatist and as a thinker that he doesn't set out to preach a sermon, he gives us an argument. And in this play, he doesn't set out to win, he sets out to force people to think.
I think they shake hands. They shake hands and agree to part. You could say that the devil and Don Juan are two different parts of Shaw, and that in each of us there is a desire for leisure and appreciation of beauty, a concern for things of the body, and on other hand, there's a more Puritan concern too for matters of the mind and a desire to control our own destiny. There will be occasions when the audience, particularly when they listen to the devil's speech about man's capacity to destroy himself or continue to destroy himself, will find a great deal of what he says as being very, very wise. I think Don Juan's philosophy is a little less comfortable, but I think that it's equally important. On an evening, a good evening in a theatre, I hope that the debate will continue after the curtain's gone down.
At the end of the whole business, when we've sat through this marathon play, where we've seen this tremendous debate between Don Juan and the devil, and we wonder which one wins and which one Shaw meant to win and whether Shaw meant either of them to win, when all that's done and gone and finished with, you ask yourself the question, oh, what's it all in aid of? What is this work and all the rest of the plays, what are they telling us of practical use? Because it's no good telling a man, look, if you behave well in 35 generations' time, your son will have a slightly larger brain than you. That's fine, but it's not of any practical use to see you through the day. When you wake up in the morning, what do? How does the Shavian dogma help you? Well, apart from the fact that Shaw's whole life was a demonstration of what to do, he said it, I think, better than any other philosopher of modern times. I think he said it better because you don't have to believe in any supernatural power. You don't have to decide not to be a Christian or to be a Christian. You don't even have to embrace creative evolution. You don't have to embrace anything. He's put it in terms of a practical guide for living. So he's given us a secular morality. This is the true joy of life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly worn out before you're thrown on the scrap heap, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy.
And Benny Green was quoting there from Shaw's preface to the play Man and Superman. Good night.